And we are happy to welcome back from the nation's capital now, retired Major General Louis MacKenzie. General MacKenzie, it's good to see you again. How are you?
Likewise, Steve. Thanks.
Let us get your understanding of why you believe Captain Robert Semrau was court-martialed. What do you think?
Well, the letter of the law, but I'm no lawyer. I mean, my interpretation is that the fact that there was an injured Taliban and that medical care was not provided, an effort wasn't made to save his life. I mean, that would be the basis, I presume, of the court-martial. And then having been found not guilty of murder, not guilty of not carrying out his duty, but being caught up in a catch-all disgraceful conduct charge. It's sort of hard to know when when you're not found guilty of the more serious charges how it was disgraceful conduct, but nevertheless that's what the finding was. We voluntarily applied the Geneva Convention to what our folks are doing over there, when in actual fact we didn't have to because we weren't fighting a uniformed force. So kudos to Canada for applying the Geneva Convention. But where I have a disagreement is that rule, that guidance about providing medical care to a wounded opponent, providing that you do not put your own individuals at additional risk, is inherent in that direction. And we were talking about an ambush situation. We're talking about a battle that was going on, Afghan soldiers ignoring the wounded Taliban, saying Allah will look after him, guts spread all over the sand and a leg hanging off, and no time to sit down and do a mental appreciation as to what is the right thing to do. We're talking about decisions that were made in seconds, not even minutes.
I'm reading between the lines here, but I get the impression that you are just not on side with this ruling.
No, I'm not, and I find myself in a rare disagreement with the leadership of the forces their statements indicated that a message had to be sent. This sends no message in my interpretation. By that I mean, Steve, when a similar situation occurs in the future and an individual Canadian leader is faced with that situation, he or she will make the decision based on their own moral compass, not what some fine print says in a regulation. And they're not going to say, gee, I remember Captain Semrau got really hammered for this. That's not going to go through their mind. You don't have time to do that. These are reflex actions. And I was disappointed that in actual fact he was released from the forces, because everyone, including the judge, indicated that he was an outstanding soldier.
Well, here's what the judge had to say. Here's a quote from the judge's ruling. "You failed in your role," the judge says, "as a leader because you chose to put aside your training and orders. Thus, you put your subordinates in one of the most precarious situations imaginable, that of knowing their leader had committed a serious breach of discipline. You might have been torn between your personal moral values and your duties as a Canadian soldier when you made your choice. But did you consider the dilemma you were inflicting upon your subordinates?"
Oh, yeah, I'm sure he was thinking about that in the 15 seconds it took him to make up his mind.
You're being facetious here, obviously.
Yeah, but you won't believe it.
Well, but do you think the judge has accurately sort of characterized what the two choices were for Semrau here?
Perhaps legally, yes. And now let me get on a slippery slope where I'm really going to pee off some people. But we have a unique situation here in Canada. We are a unified force. It wasn't a good idea in the beginning, but nevertheless, Hellyer insisted upon it, and we are unified.
That's the Defense Minister, Paul Hellyer, from back in the Trudeau days.
That's correct, and I guess the green uniform was the manifestation of that, most obvious to the public. And that, we have taken that unification and we've removed it at the sharp end, at the Air Force, Navy, and Army level, down at the unit level, battalions of 600 and brigades of 4,000 and ships and squadrons of aircraft. But it's still unified at the very top, including within the legal side of the Defense Department and Canadian forces. And therefore, in other nations, when there's a court-martial, Army officers try Army officers, Navy officers try Navy officers, Air Force officers try Air Force officers, Marines are tried by Marines and the Navy because they're part of the Navy in the United States. In Canada, where they reach in and select individuals randomly, I'm not putting any blame on the individuals here at all because they didn't volunteer for this, they were selected. We had Navy, Air Force, and the Army personnel, junior personnel on the board were in fact not from the combat arms, infantry, armored artillery,
And
combat
what's wrong with
engineers.
that?
What's wrong with that is not this sort of wild accusation, they've never been in combat, so how would they know? Nor had they been trained to be in combat. Even in their most basic training, when they're 18, 19, 20 years of age, their training was specialized and technical, or in another environment, Air Force, Navy. They weren't trained as combat officers, and you would think, even randomly, one of them would have been able to put this in context, and that was not possible. And therefore, once again, I'm not pointing fingers at them, but I think the system should change so each service court-martials its own, and then context will be obvious to the members of the board.
Let me draw upon your more than 3 decades of experience in the Canadian Forces to get your view on this. Is there, in fact, an unspoken, say, tacit code among people who wear the uniform that mercy killings are okay?
Absolutely not. It's not, and each individual will make his mind up at the time and be driven to that decision, but not because there's some secret handshake, secret code or whatever. I know it's talked about a lot, and every one of us that I know, my friends, etc., have repeated over and over ad nauseum that in my case, if it was me and I was in intense pain and there was no chance of survival, I mean, this was a helicopter gunship round that went through this guy's gut and also ripped off the leg on its way. I mean, there is no way that I would want anything but, please, please, God, put me out of my misery.
Even though that I mean, this is the thing the judge pointed to, was fine, you have your own moral code about, you know, what the humane thing to do is in that circumstance, but it violates the letter of the law, and the letter of the law is what it's all about. Isn't that right?
I haven't read that law. I wouldn't be familiar with that law when I'm in the field.
Okay, how about chain of command then?
Same thing. Absolutely not familiar with that. Nobody ever said, General MacKenzie, make sure, you know, if there's a wounded combatant and it's a dangerous situation and you're not going to risk your own soldiers, increase the risk to them by dealing with it, you know, you're not allowed to shoot the guy. I mean, talk to Korean vets, talk to World War II vets. This wasn't common, but it certainly happened frequently. And it happened to some of our own people doing it to our own people. And this is not something that in some sterile court-martial room on this side of the Atlantic over a 2-year period can really recreate those 1 or 2 minutes that took place.
I understand. So what do you think a more appropriate punishment for the captain should have been?
I would have given him a severe reprimand. And a severe reprimand is different from a reprimand in that a reprimand is removed from your file after a couple of years. I don't know what the current regulation is, but a severe reprimand stays on your file, and it would have an impact on his promotion. It wouldn't cancel any potential promotion, but it certainly would have slowed up his rank progress.
But basically, he would be allowed to stay with the force and do his job.
Absolutely, and what a perfect place to send him right now over to Afghanistan to be one of the 700 trainers we're hearing about today.
How much of the law do you think Canadian forces are expected to remember in the heat of battle?
Well, most of it's, you know, going back to my philosophy training, natural law. I mean, it's not something that you have to check the fine print. It's something that is automatic, and it's like ethical decisions. I mean, I can't believe it. I'm still lecturing on this, you know, 18 years later, and when I get to a tip on leadership of ethical decision making, I say, don't read the book, don't read the regulation. When you're faced with an ethical dilemma, and this was, imagine someone you love looking over your shoulder. That's all you have to do. We normally make bad ethical decisions when we're alone. And if you imagine someone you love looking over your shoulder, passing judgment on you, 99 times out of 100, you'll do the right thing.
And the right thing in this case, in your view, would have been to do what?
In the context as I understand it, I would not have done the same thing. But I can't put myself in that position because there's the intensity of the adrenaline and being in the middle of an ambush and being shot at and having your own Afghan soldiers, some of which were high on drugs, all around you and ignoring the individual. It's not fair for me to pass judgment on it. I can understand why Captain Semrau did what he did.
This is a bit unfair of me to do, but you know, because no two battles are alike, and no soldier's circumstances are exactly the same. But you know, you've been under fire. you've been in Bosnia, you've been places where the bullets have been firing by, and when you're in those moments, do you actually say to yourself, I got to keep in mind here what the Geneva Convention allows, what Canadian law allows, what the Canadian military protocol is under these circumstances? Do people actually think that?
Yeah, I can answer it, but I can't answer it with the intensity that those that are in Afghanistan. I mean, in Bosnia, I was being shot at by belligerents who just didn't like me. There wasn't a geopolitical battle going on. I was a peacekeeper, and the last thing they needed over there was a peacekeeper. And my number 1 priority as a result of that, the situation the United Nations put us into, were my own people. And I'm delighted to say that none of them were killed. But when I try and put myself into the context of Afghanistan, I can unequivocally say, no, you're not considering the fine print. You know the rules of engagement, you know when you can fire back, etc. But there's nothing in the sub-paragraph that talks about putting a mortally wounded individual who's been blown out of a tree by a helicopter gunship out of his misery.
Because again, this is not a perfect analogy, but I can remember a big debate in Toronto several years ago when they said to police officers, every time you unholster your gun, you're going to have to fill out a form. And the argument was, you can't make officers do that because if that's in the back of their head, they may hesitate at a key moment and it might cost them their lives because no one wants to do the paperwork. Is it the same kind of thing in battle?
I would think so, yeah. I've not had the privilege of being in the type of situation that our modern army is in, but I certainly think so. And even as the leader, you have to give, because it's a split-second decision, some freedom of movement and freedom of decision to your subordinates, and then back them. And in this case, we have a unique situation that wouldn't even come to light. I mean, it was a couple of months after it happened if it hadn't been for a member of the team who Captain Semrau didn't feel was up to it physically to keep up with the operation and was about to get rid of him, who decided 2 months later that he would start talking about all this. Now, I'm not suggesting it should have been covered up. On the contrary, if it hadn't have been dealt with and somebody starts talking about it now, I mean, everybody from the Prime Minister on down would probably be accused of a cover-up because the shadow of Somalia was hanging over the whole thing.
But one of the aspects of this debate is whether or not our soldiers have, quote unquote, their own correct ethical, moral code to make these decisions in the field, or whether there needs to be hard, fast, absolute rules, laws in place so that none of this discretion is ever called upon. I mean, you know our troops as well as anybody. Do you think our people individually have that right moral code to be able to make the right decision under fire at that moment on a second's notice?
Steve, it's been, I don't know, 20,000 guys and gals of young soldiers who've served and outstanding leaders from the generals on down in Afghanistan. And this is the first event. And it's been controversial to say the least. And there are a large number of folks out there that can understand what Semrau did. I think that's a credit to the training of the Canadian Forces and, more importantly, to their actions in the field. I have no concern whatsoever about their ethical standards or moral values, and I would leave it to those standards the next time someone is faced with a current situation and not try. The last thing I try to do is write about it and write a regulation to cover it. I'll leave that to the green-shielded folks here inside the Ottawa city limits.
Understood. General MacKenzie, as always, good of you to come on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Steve.